Hi everyone, I'm Suana Sedai from the Weaves of the Will community. Today we're continuing with the Weaves of the Will read-along, and we finished chapter 1 yesterday. That was finished by our Keeper of the Chronicles, May Sedai from the Brown Jar. And just to give you a quick recap, so we kind of had an introduction to Emansfield in chapter 1, and it was a little bit of a description about Rand's journey from where he lives in the Westwood just to the village, and they're sort of talking about how the winter's been particularly harsh and they haven't really gone into the village very much in recent weeks. I think they said they hadn't been for like 4 weeks, and that living out in the Westwood is becoming more and more difficult, and that a lot of farmers are sort of giving up farming out there. So they've travelled in, and along the way Rand spots a black hooded man on a horse where there really shouldn't be anyone, and this man on the horse disappears out of sight very, very quickly. Rand sort of topples it up to his imagination. You know, the Westwood doesn't have that same kind of safety that it used to have when he was growing up. He's, you know, been a little bit put off by the fact that they haven't done this journey in a few weeks, and the winter is dragging out far longer than it's supposed to. And he puts it down to his imagination, and they continue their journey. They arrive into the village of Emansfield, and there's a couple of descriptions about the houses and how the village is sort of laid out. Talks about the Wine Spring Inn being sort of the centre place with the village green. We have a very quick introduction to the Coplins and the Congars, and we know that Tam is, Rand's father is a little bit of a desirable widow who everyone wants to pair off. Then Rand meets up with his friends in Matt and Perrin, and they also confirm that they have seen this stranger on the horse, which obviously puts Rand into a little bit of shock that, you know, this wasn't something that he imagined seeing. This is very, very real, and suddenly things are not feeling quite as safe at home as they once did. Then there's a little bit about that there's a gleeman in town, there's strangers in the village. Things are definitely very different this year compared to what they normally do year on year. It seems that Emansfield is a place that's very much set in its ways. It's always been this way, it always has, it's always the same year after year after year, and suddenly there's a couple of things that are ever so slightly out of the ordinary and a little bit different. Also, we know that Matt and Dav managed to capture a badger, which is obviously a tale of its own. So we're going to continue with chapter 2 today on the read along. Chapter 2 is called Strangers, so we're going to get away from the introduction of the village and actually get into what is different. It is Beltane in Emansfield, and the village green is being set, the spring pole is being erected, and the village is getting ready to celebrate. So let's continue with chapter 2 of Eye of the World, Strangers. When Rand and Matt carried the first barrels through the common room, Master Alvir was already filling a pair of mugs with his best brown ale, his own make, from one of the casks racked up against one wall. Scratch, the inn's yellow cat, crouched atop with his eyes closed and his tail wrapped around his feet. Tam stood in front of the big fireplace of river rock, thumbing a long stem pipe full of tabac from a polished canister the innkeeper always kept on the plain stone mantel. The fireplace stretched half the length of the big square room, with a lintel as high as a man's shoulder, and the crackling blaze on the hearth vanquished the chill outside. At that time of the busy day before the festival, Rand expected to find the common room empty except for Bran and his father and the cat. The former members of the village council, including Sen, sat in high-backed chairs in front of the fire, mugs in hand, and blay-grey pipe smoke wreathing their heads. For once, none of the stone boards were in use, and all of Bran's books stood idle on the shelf opposite the fireplace. The men did not even talk, peering silently into their ale or tapping pipe stems against their teeth in impatience as they waited for Tam and Bran to join them. Worry was not uncommon for the village council these days, not in Eamon's Field, and likely not in Watch Hill, or Devon Ride, or even Tarran Ferry, though who knew what Tarran Ferry folk really thought about anything. Only two of the men before the fire, Harel Luhan, the blacksmith, and John Fane, the miller, so much as glanced at the boys as they enter. Master Luhan, though, made more than a glance. The blacksmith's arms were as big as most man's legs, roped with heavy muscle, and he still wore his long leather apron as if he had hurried to the meeting straight from the forge. His frown took them both in. Then he straightened around his chair deliberately, turning his attention back to an over-studious tamping of his pipe with a thick thumb. Curious, Ran slowed, then barely bit back a yelp as Matt kicked his ankle. His friend nodded insistently towards the door at the back of the common room and hurried on without waiting. Limping slightly, Ran followed less quickly. "What was that about?" he demanded as soon as he was in the hall that led to the kitchen. "You almost broke my—" "It's old Luhan," Matt said, peering past Ran's shoulder into the common room. "I think he suspects I was the one who—" He cut off abruptly as Mistress Elvire bustled out of the kitchen, the aroma of fresh-baked bread wafting ahead of her. The tray in hands carried some of the crusty loaves for which she was famous around Eamon's Field, as well as plates of pickles and cheese. The food reminded Rand abruptly that he had eaten only an end of bread before leaving the farm that morning. His stomach gave an embarrassing rumble. A slender woman, with her thick braid of greying hair pulled over one shoulder, Mistress Elvire smiled in a motherly fashion that took them both in. "There's more of this in the kitchen if you two are hungry, and I never knew boys your age who weren't, or any other age for that matter, if you prefer. I'm baking honey cakes this morning." She was one of the few married women in the area who never tried to play matchmaker with Tam. Towards Rand, her motherliness extended to warm smiles and a quick snack whenever he came by the inn, but she did as much for every young man in the area. If she occasionally looked at him as if she wanted to do more, at least she never took it further than looks, for which he was deeply grateful. Without waiting for a reply, she swept into the common room. Immediately, there was the sound of chairs scraping on the floor as the men got to their feet, and exclaimings over the smell of bread. She was easily the best cook in Eamon's Field, and not a man for miles around her eagerly leaped at a chance to put his feet under her table. Euphemisms. "Honey cakes," Matt said, smacking his lips. "After," Rand said firmly, "or we'll never get it done." A lamp hung on the ceiling stairs just beside the kitchen door, and another made a bright pool in the stone-walled room beneath the inn, banishing all but a little dimness in the furthest corners. Wooden racks along the walls and across the floor held casks of brandy and cider, and a larger barrel of ale and wine, some with taps driven in. Many of the wine barrels were marked with chalk in Bran Elvire's hand, given the year they had been bought, what peddler had brought them in, and from which city they had been made. But all of the ale and brandy was the make of Two Rivers farmers, or of Bran himself. Peddlers and even merchants sometimes bought brandy or ale from outside, but it was never as good, and it cost the earth besides, and nobody ever drank it more than once. "Now," Rand said, as they set their casks in racks, "what did you have to do to avoid Master Lohan?" Matt shrugged. "Nothing, really. I told Adan Elkar and some of his snot-nosed friends, Ewan Finger and Dag Coplin, that some farmers had seen ghost hounds, breathing fire and running across the woods. They ate it up like clotted cream." "And Master Lohan is mad at you for that?" Rand said doubtfully. "Not exactly," Matt paused, then shook his head. "You see, I covered two of his dogs with flour so they were all white. Then I let them loose near Dag's house. How was I to know they'd run straight home? It really isn't my fault. If Mistress Lohan hadn't left the door open, they couldn't have got inside. It isn't like I intended to get flour all over her house." He gave a bark of laughter. She chased old Lohan and the dogs, all three, out the house with a broom. Rand winced and laughed at the same time. "If I were you, I'd worry more about Elsbeth Luhan than about the blacksmith. She's almost as strong and her temper's a lot worse." No matter though, if you walk fast, maybe he won't notice you. Matt's expression said he did not think Rand was funny. When he went back through the common room though, there was no need for Matt to hurry. The 6 men had their chairs in tight knot before the fireplace, with his back to the fire. Tam was speaking in a low voice, and the others were leaning forward to listen, so intent on his words they would not likely have noticed if a flock of sheep had been driven through. Rand wanted to move closer to hear what they were talking about, but Matt plucked at his sleeve and gave him an agonised look. With a sigh, he followed Matt out to the cart. On their return to the hallway, they found a tray by the top of the steps with hot honey cakes filling the hall with their sweet aroma. There were 2 mugs as well and a pitcher of steaming mulled cider. Despite his own admiration about waiting until later, Rand found himself making the last 2 trips between cart and cellar while trying to juggle a cask and piping hot honey cake. Setting his final cask in the racks, he wiped crumbs from his mouth while Matt was unburdening himself, then said, "Now, for the glee." Feet clattered on the stairs, and Ewan Finnegan's half fell into the cellar in haste, his pudgy face shining with eagerness to impart his news. "There are strangers in the village." He caught his breath and gave Matt a wry look. "I haven't seen any ghost hounds, but I hear someone flowered Master Lohan's dogs. I hear Mistress Lohan has ideas who to look for too." The years separating Rand and Matt from Ewan, only 14, were usually more than enough for them to give short shrift to anything he had to say. This time they exchanged one startled glance, then both were talking at once. "In the village?" Rand asked. "Not in the woods?" Right on top of him, Matt added, "Was his cloak black? Could you see his face?" Ewan looked uncertainly from one of them to the other, then spoke quickly when Matt took threatening step. "Of course I could see his face, and his coat is green, or maybe it's grey. It changes. It seems to fade to wherever he's standing. Sometimes you don't even see him when you look right at him, not unless he moves, and hers is blue, like the sky, and 10 times fancier than any feast day clothes I ever saw. She's 10 times prettier than anybody I ever saw too. She's a highborn lady, like in the stories. She must be." "Her," Rand said. "Who are you talking about?" He stared at Matt, who had put both hands on top of his head and squeezed his eyes shut. "They're the ones I meant to tell you about," Matt muttered. "Before you got me onto—" He cut off, opening his eyes with a sharp glance at Ewan. "They arrived last evening," Matt went on after a moment, "and took rooms here at the inn. I saw them ride in. They're horses, Rand. I never saw horses so tall or so sleek. They looked like they could run forever. I think he works for her." "In service," Ewan broke in. "They call it being in service in the stories." Matt continued as if Ewan had not spoken. "Anyway, he defers to her, does what she says. Only he isn't like a hired man. A soldier, maybe? The way he wears his sword, that's part of him, like his hand or his foot. He makes the merchants' guards look like her dogs, and her, Rand. I never even imagined anyone like her. She's out of a Gleeman story. She's like... He paused to give Ewan a sour look. "Like a highborn lady," he finished with a sigh. "But who are they?" Rand asked. "Except for merchants once a year to buy tabac and wool, and the peddlers, outsiders never came to the 2 Rivers. Or as good as never. Maybe at Tarrant Ferry, but not this far south. Most of the merchants and peddlers had been coming for years too, so they did not really count as strangers, just outsiders. It was a good 5 years since the last time a real stranger appeared in Eamondsfield, and he'd been trying to hide from some sort of trouble up in Baelon. That nobody in the village understood. He had not stayed long. What do they want?" "What do they want?" Matt exclaimed. "I don't care what they want. Strangers, Rand, and strangers like you never even dreamed of. Think of it." Rand opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. The Black Cloak rider had him as nervous as a cat in a dog run. It just seemed like an awful coincidence. 3 strangers around the village at the same time. 3, if this fellow's cloak that changed colours never changed to black. "Her name is Moraine," Ewan said. A momentary silence. "I heard him say it. Moraine, he called her. The Lady Moraine. His name is Lan. The Wisdom may not like her, but I do." "What makes you think Nynaeve dislikes her?" Rand said. "She asked the Wisdom for directions this morning," Ewan said, "and called her
child. Rand and Matt both whistled softly through their teeth, and Ewan tripped over his tongue in haste to explain. The Lady Moraine didn't know she was the wisdom. She apologised when she found out she did, and asked some questions about herbs and who is around Eamondsfield just as respectfully as any woman in the village, more so than some. She's always asking questions about how old people are and how long they've lived where they live and, oh, I don't know what all. Anyway, Nynaeve answered like she'd bitten a green strawberry. Then, when the Lady Moraine walked away, Nynaeve stared after her like, well, it wasn't friendly, I can tell you that. Is that all? Rand said. You know Nynaeve's temper. When Senbui called her a child last year, she thumped him on the head with her stick, and he's on the village council, and old enough to be her grandfather beside. She flares up at anything and never stays angry past turning around. That's too long for me, Ewan muttered. I don't care who Nynaeve thumps, Matt chortled, so long as it isn't me. This is going to be the best Beltane ever. A gleeman, a lady, who could ask for more? Who needs fireworks? A gleeman, Ewan said, his voice rising sharply. Come on, Rand, Matt went on, ignoring the younger boy. We're done here. You have to see this fellow. He bounded up the stairs with Ewan scrambling behind him, calling, Is there really a gleeman, Matt? This isn't like the ghost hounds, is it? Or the frogs? Rand paused long enough to turn down the lamp, then hurried after them. In the common room, Rowan Hearn and Samuel Craw had joined the others in front of the fire, so the entire village council was there. Bran Alvear spoke now, his normally bluff voice pitched so low that only a rumbling murmur travelled beyond the close-gathered chairs. The mayor emphasised his words by tapping a thick forefinger into the palm of his other hand and eyeing each man in turn. They all nodded in agreement with whatever he was saying, though Sen more reluctantly than the rest. The way the men all but huddled together spoke more plainly than a painted sign. Whatever they were talking about, it was for the village council alone, at least now. They would not appreciate Rand trying to listen in. Reluctantly, he pulled himself away. There was still the gleeman, and these strangers. Outside, Bella and the cart were gone, taken away by Hugh or Tad, the inn stableman. Matt and Ewan stood glaring at one another, a few paces from the front door of the inn, their cloaks whipping in the wind. For the last time, Matt barked, I'm not playing a trick on you. There is a gleeman. Now go away. Rand, will you tell this warhead I'm telling the truth so he'll leave me alone? Pulling his cloak together, Rand stepped forward to support Matt, but his word died as the hair stirred on the back of his neck. He was being watched again. It was far from the feeling the hooded rider had given him, but neither was it pleasant, especially so soon after that encounter. A quick look about the green showed him only what he had seen before. Children playing, people preparing for the festival, and no one more than glancing in his direction. The spring pole stood alone now, waiting. Bustle and childish shouts filled the side streets. All was as it should be, except that he was being watched. Then something led him to turn around, to raise his eyes. On the edge of the inn's tile roof perched a large raven, swaying a little in the gusting wind from the mountains. Its head was cocked to one side, and a beady black eye was focused on him, he thought. He swallowed, and suddenly anger flickered in him, hot and sharp. Filthy carrion eater, he muttered. I'm tired of being stared at, Matt growled, and Rand realised his friend had stepped up beside him and was frowning at the raven too. They exchanged a glance. Then one of their hands darted for rocks. The two stones flew true, and the raven stepped aside. The stones whistled through the space where it had been, fluffing its wings once, its cocked head again, fixing them with a dead black eye, unafraid, giving no sign that anything could happen. Rand stared at the bird in consternation. Did you ever see a raven do that? He asked quietly. Matt shook his head without looking away from the raven. Never, nor any other bird either. A vile bird, came a woman's voice from behind them, melodious despite echoes of distaste, to be mistrusted in the best of times. With a shrill cry, the raven launched itself into the air so violently that two black feathers drifted down from the roof's edge. Startled, Rand and Matt twisted to follow the bird's swift flight over the green and towards the cloud-tipped mountains of mist, tall beyond the westward, until it dwindled, to a speck in the west, then vanished from view. Rand's gaze fell to the woman who had spoken. She too had been watching the flight of the raven, but now she turned back. Her eyes met his. He could only stare. This had to be the Lady Moraine, and she was everything that Matt and Ewan had said. Everything and more. When he had heard she had called Nynaeve child, he had pictured her as old, but she was not. At least he could not put any age to her at all. At first he thought she was as young as Nynaeve, but the longer he looked, the more he thought she was older than that. There was a maturity about her large dark eyes, a hint of knowing that no one could have gotten young. For an instant, he thought those eyes were deep pools about to swallow him up. It was plain why Matt and Ewan named her a lady from a gleeman's tale too. She held herself with a grace of air and command that made him feel awkward and stubble-footed. She was barely tall enough to come up to his chest, but her presence was such that her height seemed the proper one, and he felt ungainly in his tallness. Altogether she was like no one he had ever seen before. The wide hood of her cloak framed her face, and dark hair hanging in soft ringlets. He had never seen a grown woman with her hair unbraided. Every girl in the Two Rivers waited eagerly for the women's circle of her village to say that she was old enough to wear a braid. Her clothes were just as strange. Her cloak was sky-blue velvet, with thick silver embroidery, leaves and vines and flowers all along the edges. Her dress gleamed faintly as she moved, a darker blue than the cloak, and slashed with cream. A necklace of heavy gold links hung around her neck, while another gold chain, delicate and fastened in her hair, supported a small sparkling blue stone in the middle of her forehead. A wild belt of woven gold encircled her waist, and on the second finger of her left hand was a gold ring in the shape of a serpent, biting its own tail. He had certainly never seen a ring like that, though he recognized the great serpent, an even older symbol for eternity than the wheel of time. Fancier than feast day clothes, Ewan had said, and he was right. No one ever dressed like that in the Two Rivers, not ever. "Good morning, Mistress, Lady Moraine," Rand said. His face grew hot at his tongue's fumbling. "Good morning, Lady Moraine," Matt echoed, somewhat more smoothly, but only a little. She smiled, and Rand found himself wondering if there was anything he might do for her, something that would give him an excuse to stay near her. He knew she was already smiling at all of them, but it seemed meant for him alone. It really was just like seeing a gleeman's tale come to life. Matt had a foolish grin on his face. "You know my name," she said, sounding delighted, as if her presence, however brief, would not be the talk of the village for a year. "But you must call me Moraine, not Lady. And what are your names?" Ewan leaped forward before either of the others could speak. "My name is Ewan Finnegar, my lady. I told them your name, that's how they know it. I heard Land say it, but I wasn't eavesdropping. No one like you has ever come to Eamon's Field before. There's a gleeman in the village for Beltane too, and tonight is Winter's night. Will you come to my house? My mother has apple cakes." "I shall have to see," she replied, putting a hand on Ewan's shoulder. Her eyes twinkled with amusement, though she gave no other sign of it. "I do not know how well I could compete against a gleeman, Ewan, but you must call me Moraine." She looked expectantly at Rand and Matt. "I'm Matrim Cawthorne, Moraine," Matt said. He made a stiff, jerking bow, then went red in the face as he straightened. Rand had been wondering if he should do something of the sort, the way men did in stories, but with Matt's example he merely spoke his name. At least he did not stumble over his own tongue this time. Moraine looked from him to Matt and back again. Rand thought her smile, a bare curve in the corners of her mouth, was the sort Egwene wore when she had a secret. "I might have some small tasks to be done from time to time while I'm in Eamon's Field," she said. "Perhaps you would be willing to assist me?" She laughed as their accents tumbled over one another. "Here," she said, and Rand was surprised when she pressed a coin into his palm, closing it tightly around with both of hers. "There's no need," he began, but she waved aside his protest as she gave Ewan a coin as well, then pressed Matt's hand around one the same way she had Rand's. "Of course there is," she said. "You cannot be expected to work for nothing. Consider this a token, and keep it with you, so you will remember that you have agreed to come to me when I ask it. There is a bond between us now." "I'll never forget," Ewan piped up. "Later, we must talk," she said. "And You must tell me all about yourselves. Lady, I mean Moraine, Rand asked hesitantly as she turned away. She stopped and looked back over his shoulder, and he had to swallow before going on. Why have you come to Emansfield? Her expression was unchanged, but suddenly he wished he had not asked, though he could not have said why. He rushed to explain himself anyway. I don't mean to be rude. I'm sorry. It's just that no one comes to the Two Rivers except the merchants and peddlers when the snow isn't too deep to get down from Baelon. Almost no one, certainly no one like you. The merchants' guards sometimes say this is the back end of forever, and I suppose it must seem that way to anyone from the outside. I just wondered. Her smile did fade then, slowly, as if something had been recalled to her. For a moment she merely looked at him. I am a student of history, she said at last, a collector of old stories. This place you call the Two Rivers, it has always interested me. Sometimes I study the stories of what happened here long ago, here and at other places. Stories, Rand said. Whatever happened in the Two Rivers to interest someone like... I mean, what could have happened here? And what else would you call it beside the Two Rivers, Matt added. This is what it's always been called. As the wheel of time turns, Moraine said, half to herself, with a distant look in her eyes. Places wear many names, men wear many names and many faces, different faces, but always the same man. Yet, no one knows the great pattern the wheel weaves, or even the pattern of an age. We can only watch and study and hope. Rand stared at her, unable to say a word, even to ask what she meant. He was not sure she had meant for them to hear. The other two were just as tongue-tied, he noticed. Ewan's mouth hung open. Moraine focused on them again, and all three gave a little shake as if waking up. Later, we will talk, she said. None of them said a word. Later. She moved towards the wagon bridge, appearing to glide over the ground rather than walk, her cloak spreading on either side like her wings. As she left, a tall man Rand had not noticed before moved away from the front of the inn and followed her, one hand resting on the long hilt of his sword. His clothes were a dark greyish green that would have faded into leaf or shadow, and his cloak swirled with shades of grey and green and brown as it shifted in the wind. It almost seemed to disappear at times, that cloak, fading into whatever lay beyond it. His hair was long and grey at the temples, held back from his face by a narrow leather headband. That face was made from stony planes and angles, weathered but unlined despite the grey in his hair. When he moved, Rand could think of nothing but a wolf. In passing the three youths, his gaze ran over them, eyes cold and blue as a mid-winter's dawn. It was as if he were weighing them in his mind, and there was no sign on his face of what the scales told him. He quickened his pace until he caught up to Moraine, then slowed to walk by her shoulder, bending to speak to her. Rand let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding. That was Lan, Ewan said throatily, as if he too had been holding his breath. It had been that kind of look. I'll bet he's a warder. Don't be a fool, Matt laughed, but it was a shaky laugh. Warders are just in stories anyway. Warders have swords and armour covered in gold and jewels. They spend all their time up north, in the Great Blight, fighting evil and Trollocs and such. He could be a warder, Ewan insisted. Did you see any gold or jewels on him? Matt scoffed. Do we have Trollocs in the Two River? We have sheep. I wonder what could ever have happened here to interest someone like her. Something could have, Rand answered slowly. They say the inn's been here for 1,000 years, maybe more. 1,000 years of sheep, Matt said. A silver penny, Ewan burst out. She gave me a whole silver penny. Think what I can buy when the peddler comes. Rand opened his hand to look at the coin she had given him, and almost dropped it in surprise. He did not recognize the fat silver coin with the raised image of a woman balancing a single flame on her upturned hand. But he had watched while Bran Alvear weighed the coin's merchants from a dozen lands and had an idea of its value. That much silver would buy a good horse anywhere in the Two Rivers, with some left over. He looked at Matt and saw the same stunned expression he knew must be on his own face. Tilting his hand so Matt could see the coin, but not Ewan, he raised a questioning eyebrow. Matt nodded. For a minute, they stared at one another in perplexed wonder. What kind of chores does she have? Rand asked finally. I don't know, Matt said firmly, and I don't care. I won't spend it either. when the peddler comes. With that, he thrust his coin into his coat pocket. Nodding, Rand slowly did the same with his. He was not sure why, but somehow what Matt had said seemed right. The coin should not be spent, not when it came from her. He could not think of anything else silver was good for, but do you think I should keep mine too? Anguished indecision painted Ewan's face. Not unless you want to, Matt said. I think she gave it to you to spend, Rand said. Ewan looked at the coin, then shook his head and stuffed the silver penny into his pocket. I'll keep it, he said mournfully. There's still the gleeman, Rand said, and the younger boy brightened. If he ever wakes up, Matt added. Rand, Ewan asked, is there a gleeman? You'll see, Rand answered with a laugh. It was clear Ewan would not believe until he set eyes on the gleeman. He has to come down sooner or later. Shouting drifted across the wagon bridge, and when Rand looked to see what was causing it, his laughter became wholehearted. A milling crowd of villagers, from grey-haired oldsters to toddlers barely able to walk, escorted a tall wagon towards the bridge. A huge wagon, drawn by 8 horses. The outside of its rounded canvas cover hung about with bundles like branches of grapes. The peddler had come at last. Strangers, and a gleeman, fireworks, and a peddler. It was going to be the best Beltane ever. That's the end of chapter 2. So we've got a little bit more than an introduction in this chapter. I mean, we've got our first introduction to Moraine and to Lan. Yeah, I like Lan. What girl doesn't like Lan? So we've got that first introductions to them, but we don't really know anything about them. They are just strangers, but there's obviously something about Moraine that, whether it's the fact that she's a stranger or the fact that she's appears to be a highborn lady, something about her presence makes the boys feel like they need to explain themselves and they need to listen to what she says and go wherever she says. If you're reading this for the first time, you're obviously going to learn a little bit more about that. I'm going to try not to add too many spoilers. But obviously she's quite an interesting character. We also know that the village council are talking quite privately. Is that a normal thing? Rand doesn't seem to think it's so normal. They're definitely keeping quite quiet in the way they're doing it, and he suggests that the men are a lot more quieter and not playing stones or reading books the way they normally would as they wait for a council meeting to start. So there's obviously an air of something being a little bit different from the norm. There's also, we're getting a little bit of an introduction into some very minor characters from the Two Rivers. Again, not to jump ahead too much to spoil, we know some of them now, we meet some of them again later. And what else? The preparations for Beltane. We are getting very, very close to this festival. Ewan stated that it's Winter's Night, which suggests that Winter's Night is obviously a part of the festival. It's something that takes place as part of the festival. So apple cakes and honey cakes, and it seems like a lot of the women in the village are baking and preparing for that. Do we see any foretelling at this stage? Well, we've got the raven that's watching the boys, and again, the boys are saying that it's not giving them the same kind of feeling that the man in the black cloak on the black horse was giving them, where he was projecting this sort of feeling of hatred. They definitely feel uncomfortable that they're being watched. It's definitely making them feel uneasy, but it's not so much that they feel that kind of strong hatred from being watched by the raven, but certainly it is, again, behaving very unusually. So a lot of what we're sensing in these first two chapters is this great sense of unease. You're at home, but home isn't feeling this safe place that it used to feel, that it normally feels. This place that you grew up is feeling very, very different. There's definitely a sense that something has changed, something in the air has turned. You've got strangers in your home, strangers that seem quite pleasant and seem quite polite, and strangers that are projecting feelings of great discomfort. Uh, there's also a gleeman. We haven't met the gleeman yet, but there's obviously a great deal of anticipation to meet the gleeman, and this is again something that's really, really unusual. So the tone is set. You're at home, but you're not feeling quite as safe and as comfortable as you once were. But certainly there's definitely a comfort in being around your friends and looking forward to the yearly festival of Beltane. So that's about it. That wraps up the first two chapters and the prologue, which we read over on Instagram Live. We know now that What on Prime is starting their book club, but that is happening predominantly over on Twitter. I know the Weeds of the Wheel community is an Instagram community. Obviously, we do have social media across the board, but predominantly everything we do takes place, and all of our members are registered on Instagram, and a lot of them don't like to use Twitter. So we're going to keep a close eye on the book club for Twitter for our followers. What we do have on Instagram is we have some chat rooms available, so they are literally just in your inbox. You can access them right on your phone at your fingertips, and there you can connect with Wheel of Time fans from all around the world. We'll keep an eye on what's going on Twitter, we'll update, we'll get questions and discussion going, and hopefully continue with our thoughts on where this book is sort of leading and what we're learning as we go ahead. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please please leave us some comments. Tell us anything you would like us to do differently, if there's anything in particular you would like for us to read, and do give us a follow over on Instagram. Please subscribe to our channel as well to keep up to date with our reading as we go along. Thanks very much. Take care then.